Every night, that cross moved on its own, and I swear it wasn't the wind that turned it.
Would you believe me if I told you that a simple iron cross, heavy and firmly planted in the frozen ground of a cemetery, could move on its own during the coldest of nights? I'm not talking about stories invented by superstitious people or legends repeated around campfires, but about an account lived and witnessed by a veteran gravedigger, a man who dedicated almost his entire life to the silence of the graves. When he finally decided to share what he witnessed, it wasn't for attention or recognition, but rather as someone who could no longer bear alone the weight of a secret that had haunted him since his youth. And I must confess that upon hearing his words, I felt as if I'd been transported into that snow-covered cemetery, feeling on my skin the soul-searing cold and the emptiness that echoed among the forgotten tombs. This gravedigger described a phenomenon that defied all logic. The cross on a particular grave, where a child who had died of pneumonia lay, would slowly rotate every night, always stopping in the same direction, as if to point out something hidden. Imagine walking alone in the darkness, with only the moon as your witness, and seeing before you a sacred object moving as if with a will of its own. He wasn't speaking of a passing fright, but of a pattern repeated so often that there was no denying it. The cross seemed alive, guided by an invisible force. The most disturbing thing, he said, was that no matter how many times he tried to reposition it, or fix it more firmly, at dawn it was always back facing the same spot. This wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't wind, it wasn't vandalism. It was something completely beyond human comprehension. And it is at this moment that the inevitable question arises. What exactly was that cross trying to show? What could possibly be beyond the reach of a lonely man's vision, yet night after night seemed to silently cry out for attention? But before revealing where that cross always pointed, you need to know the setting where it all happened, because only by understanding the atmosphere of that frozen village will you be able to feel the real dimension of what was about to emerge from the darkness. If this story has already given you chills, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. That way you won't miss any of the next dark stories I have to tell. The town where I grew up and lived much of my life has always been small, almost erased from the map. A forgotten American village nestled among hills, surrounded by forests that seemed to swallow the roads and drive away any curious visitor. In winter, the snow covered everything with a thick layer of white, but it didn't bring the beauty seen on Christmas cards. On the contrary, it made the silence even heavier, muffling sounds and making the cemetery feel like a land frozen in time, as if each cross were a memory hardened by the cold of the night. It was in this setting that I worked every early morning. The streets were deserted after sunset, and the few remaining houses lit their fireplaces like small islands of warmth amidst the frozen vastness. Walking to the cemetery was like crossing an invisible border, a space where life seemed suspended, and all that remained was the breath of the wind cutting through my skin. I knew every stone, every twisted tree, and every time-scarred grave. But even with all this familiarity, there was something in the air that made me feel watched. The village had a strange tradition. Everyone avoided speaking about death out loud, as if uttering certain words would summon unwanted presences. It was a simple community, accustomed to loss, but also haunted by secrets buried with its dead. I learned early on that the place wasn't just cold because of the climate, but also because there was a kind of invisible weight on every corner, as if something unseen hovered constantly around us. And perhaps that's why, when the cross began to move on its own, I knew, even without admitting it, that this wasn't just another passing mystery. It was as if the village itself had already been prepared to guard this dark secret. I grew accustomed early on to the solitude that accompanies the life of a gravedigger. It wasn't a profession chosen out of ambition or status, but rather out of necessity and endurance. While many avoided even looking inside the cemetery gates, I found there my routine, my livelihood, and, in a way, even a strange sense of peace. The silence among the graves never bothered me. On the contrary, it was in this silence that I could organize my thoughts, even when life outside seemed like a whirlwind. Early mornings were the time when I felt most like I owned that territory. There was only me, the biting cold, and the crosses lined up like guardians of a collective secret. My routine was almost always the same: checking that no graves had been disturbed, clearing the snow-covered walkways, gathering fallen branches from the twisted trees, and ensuring that the candles left by families didn't set the dry grass ablaze. There was something ritualistic about these repeated gestures, as if I were responsible for maintaining order in a kingdom that didn't belong to me. Over time, I learned to identify sounds most people would never notice. The crack of freezing wood, the creak of iron pressed against ice, the muffled sound of nocturnal animals burrowing beneath the snow. These details were part of my craft, and I would never mistake them for something supernatural. That's why, when I first noticed the child's upturned cross, I knew immediately it was no ordinary noise, no natural movement. Something was wrong, something that didn't fit the explanations I'd always used to calm my mind. And it was at this point that the once predictable routine began to transform into a silent nightmare. Because it's one thing to find a vandalized grave or a candle snuffed out by the wind. It's quite another to feel like the cemetery itself has begun to move against you. That particular night, the cold seemed even more relentless than usual. The air was so frigid that every breath left a white trail in front of my face, and the silence was so profound that my footsteps echoed among the tombstones. I was already accustomed to the darkness of the cemetery, but there was something different about that early morning, as if an invisible expectation hovered over the place. As I walked, the beam of my flashlight reflected off the metal of the crosses, creating tiny sparks that danced in the snow. It was in this play of shadows that I noticed something strange about the child's grave. The iron cross, which should have been facing the main gate, was turned the other way. My heart raced at the time, but I tried to convince myself it must just be an optical illusion. I approached and confirmed. The piece was indeed turned. It was impossible to ignore. I had driven that cross myself days earlier with all my strength, pounding the iron into the hardened earth. It couldn't move easily, especially on the ground, frozen by winter. The first explanation that came to mind was that some vandal had taken advantage of the early morning silence to mock the dead. But there were no footprints in the snow around the tomb, no mark to betray the presence of anyone other than myself. I leaned down, gripped the cross with both hands, and repositioned it in the correct direction, trying to dispel the uneasiness consuming me. Still, as I walked away, I couldn't help but glance back several times, as if expecting to see it spin before my eyes again. Nothing happened at that moment, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me until the end of my shift. I went home trying to rationalize, telling myself that there must be a logical explanation, that maybe I was just too tired. But the truth is, deep down, I already knew that this wasn't a passing coincidence. It was just the first sign that something unusual had awakened in that cemetery. And I would soon discover that I was not mistaken, because the following night the cross would move again. And this time, there would be no denying the impossible. The next night, I returned to the cemetery, determined to prove to myself that it was all a mistake. I walked among the graves more attentively than ever, observing every detail as if searching for a flaw that would justify what I had seen before. The cold seemed more intense, and the wind blew low, causing the trees to move unsettlingly, but still, there was nothing that could explain what happened when my eyes once again fell upon the child's grave. The cross was turned over again. This time, I didn't allow myself the luxury of dwelling on coincidences. There were no footprints, no fresh marks in the snow, nothing to indicate anyone had disturbed the place. It was as if an invisible hand had turned the heavy iron in the early morning, silent, merciless, leaving no trace. I stood there for long, minutes, staring at the object, waiting for something to move in front of me. My heart was pounding, and my shallow breaths created white clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. I then decided to test my own sanity. I hammered the cross even harder, pounding its base against the frozen ground until my arms ached. I made marks in the surrounding snow to make sure nothing went unnoticed. I felt foolish for acting this way, but I needed concrete proof. But at dawn, when I returned to check, the marks were still intact, and the cross once again pointed elsewhere. From that moment on, repetition became torment. Night after night, the same phenomenon repeated itself, like an invisible clock that never failed. I began to feel I wasn't alone, as if the very silence of the cemetery held eyes watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Even the sounds I knew so well began to sound different. The cracking of ice seemed closer. The creaking of iron sounded like muffled voices. And every shadow cast by the moon became a potential figure. And it was thus, in this cycle of fear and distrust, that I realized the cross wasn't moving randomly. It seemed to point insistently in a specific direction. It took me a few nights to accept what my eyes had been telling me from the start. The cross wasn't rotating randomly. It wasn't a meaningless movement. Each time I found it turned, I realized it pointed precisely to a single spot outside the cemetery's boundaries. At first, I tried to ignore this coincidence, as if fear would convince me I was only seeing what I wanted to see. But there was no denying it. The heavy iron, night after night, insisted on pointing in the same direction. It was on a silent, windless dawn, with the moon hidden behind clouds, that I decided to follow the invisible line the cross seemed to trace. I aimed the flashlight and let the beam cut through the darkness, advancing until I lost sight of the cemetery walls. And then I realized the cross always stopped facing the small wooden house at the end of the narrow street, the house of the child's mother. I remembered her immediately, a lonely woman marked by grief who since her son's death seemed frozen in time. Many said she lit candles every night, praying until dawn, as if hoping the flames would bring the boy back. Some claimed to have seen her motionless silhouette at the window, like a silent sentinel, staring into the void. That night, as I gazed at the distance between the cemetery and the house, I felt something tighten in my chest. The cross seemed to want to bridge that gap, as if it were a bridge between two worlds, death and life. I didn't know if it was a gesture of love or a disturbing call, but with each movement of the cross, the message became clearer. Little by little, I began to believe it wasn't vandalism, nor wind, nor any logical explanation. The child's soul was restless. It sought to return to its mother's arms. And it was precisely at this point that the story stopped being just my secret, because if I had noticed this hidden direction, soon the whole village would begin to notice it too. It didn't take long for others to realize what was happening. In the village, secrets aren't kept for long, and soon murmurs began to arise among the villagers. Some said I was making it all up to attract attention, others claimed it was a divine sign, and still others preferred to avoid comment, as if silence could protect them from a greater curse. But the fact is, More and more people began to notice that the cross on that grave always faced the grieving mother's house. Visits to the cemetery declined dramatically. Families who once came to pray or leave flowers began to avoid the site, as if fearing witnessing something they were unprepared to see. Even the elderly, accustomed to dealing with loss and war stories, refused to cross the gates after sunset. The cemetery, which already carried a natural weight, became a forbidden space, shrouded in an aura of superstition. I, in turn, felt increasingly isolated. The residents' perspective had changed. Some saw me as the guardian of a secret, others as an accomplice in a dark event. Once, a woman stopped me in the middle of the street and, with a trembling voice, asked if I wasn't afraid that the child's spirit would follow me home. I didn't know how to respond. The truth is, the fear was already within me. Growing with each night, I walked alone among the graves. Little by little, I realized that the phenomenon had ceased to be just my private torment. The entire village breathed the invisible tension that hung over that cross. It was as if everyone, silently, awaited the outcome of something inevitable. And on that last night, when the cold seemed to cut my skin like blades, I finally witnessed what I should never have seen. That last night, the cold felt different, as if the entire winter had decided to gather over the cemetery. The wind wasn't blowing, but the air was so heavy I could barely breathe. I walked to the child's grave with the feeling that something definitive was about to happen. The snow crunched under my feet, and as I approached, I saw that the cross stood motionless, exactly as I had left it the night before. For a moment I believed everything was over, that finally the restlessness had ceased. It was then that I heard the sound. A low, metallic creak, like iron scraping against iron. I stared at the cross, and before my eyes, it began to move. It wasn't a sudden movement, but slow, deliberate, as if invisible hands were gently pushing it. I felt a cold shiver run through every bone in my body, and despite myself, I moved closer. I placed my hands on the cold iron, trying to hold it, but I realized it was no use. There was a greater force, cold and implacable, that could not be contained. The cross spun against my resistance, stopping once more in the direction of the small house. At that moment, I heard a muffled cry, coming from nowhere, a childish sound that seemed to echo among the tombstones, as if the wind itself had taken the child's voice. I looked around, and there was no one, just me, the cemetery, and the grief materialized in a cry that should no longer exist. The feeling was that the entire space around me had been taken over by something that didn't belong in this world. I walked away, unable to stay there, but carrying the certainty that I had witnessed something I could never explain. From that night on, I could never look at that house without feeling a presence watching me through the window. The village continued to murmur, some in devotion, others in fear, but no one ever approached the child's grave again. And to this day, when I remember that cross spinning against my own strength, I know that some stories find no peace. They just spread, contaminating other places, other tombs, other nights. Because if that cross could move on its own, imagine what else can awaken when the silence of the cemetery is too deep. I always thought I'd seen it all inside a cemetery. Spending so many nights among tombs and crosses taught me to differentiate the sound of a falling twig from the distant sound of an animal prowling in the dark. Nothing seemed truly capable of surprising me after so many years of witnessing the silence of death. But on that particular dawn, I discovered I was wrong. There was a kind of mystery that no experience or logic could explain, something that went beyond the biting cold and the night's solitude. Imagine dozens of heavy crosses, some made of iron, others of ancient wood, all lined up in a specific section of the cemetery. Now imagine that suddenly these crosses began to rotate slowly, as if obeying an invisible command. There was no wind in that area, no storm to explain it. Only the sound of iron scraping against the ice-hardened base and the impossible sight of a synchronized movement, as if guided by hands no one could see. I was accompanied by other gravediggers that night. Men who, like me, had buried more bodies than they cared to count. None of us were given to superstition, but when the crosses began to move simultaneously, we all felt the same chill run down our spines. This wasn't a simple trick of the weary mind. It was real. It was happening before our eyes, and no matter how much we tried to deny it, we felt like we were witnessing something that should never have happened. The most disturbing thing was realizing that the movement wasn't random. It kept. Crosses didn't rotate haphazardly, nor did they tilt haphazardly. They turned together slowly, obediently, until they stopped in a single direction. And it was at that moment that a question began to gnaw at us. What exactly were they trying to convey? The answer to this question would only come later, but to understand it, we must go back to the beginning of that freezing night, when everything seemed normal, until the silence of the cemetery became a witness to something impossible to ignore. If this story has already given you chills, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. That way you won't miss any of the next dark stories I have to tell. That night had begun like so many others, marked by a chill that seemed to penetrate to the bone. The sky was covered in dense clouds, and the moon barely broke through the darkness. Each step we took sank into the snow, leaving a silent trail that disappeared soon after. We were 4 gravediggers, accustomed to sharing the solitude of our work, but that early morning there was something different about our silence. None of us spoke much, perhaps because our own breath, transformed into white clouds, already seemed to take up too much space in the icy immensity. The cemetery in that part of town always carried a heavy atmosphere, and though we were all accustomed to the routine of guarding graves, that night it seemed the air was thick with an invisible anticipation. We walked together, but each of us felt the strange sensation of something watching us from the shadows. Sounds were minimal, the crackle of ice beneath our boots and the distant rustle of bare trees, unable to move in the suffocating stillness. I remember well the faces of each of my colleagues, rugged, hardened men, but with a silent respect for the place where we worked in their eyes. None of them were given to superstition. None of them were swayed by gossip about ghosts. Even so, that early morning, everyone was alert in a different way, as if they instinctively knew something was about to shatter the balance of silence. And it didn't take long for this feeling to be confirmed. As we turned the corner that led to the oldest section of the cemetery, we noticed the first movement. The crosses in that field weren't as they should have been. As soon as we entered that older section, something made us all stop almost simultaneously. There was a strangeness in the air, an uneasiness that couldn't be explained solely by the cold or the darkness. The dim light from the lanterns illuminated rows of lined crosses, some already corroded by time, others standing firm like silent sentinels. But that early morning, they weren't as still as they should always be. I saw it first, but I know the others noticed it instantly. The crosses were moving. They weren't swaying randomly or trembling as if stirred by some sudden wind. They were rotating slowly, as if obeying an inaudible command, a movement so precise it seemed choreographed. The metallic sound of iron scraping against the frozen base permeated the silence, creating the unsettling sensation that we were witnessing an occult ritual. The most frightening thing was that only those crosses moved. The rest of the cemetery remained completely silent, static, indifferent. The wind didn't blow there, and yet the movement occurred before our eyes, each cross turning in the same direction, as if responding to an invisible force that manifested only in that patch of land. No one dared speak for a few seconds. It was as if even our voices were trapped, frozen by the terror that loomed before us. I tried to search my mind for explanations. Perhaps the ground was giving way. Perhaps there was some natural phenomenon we didn't understand. But each time more crosses moved together, each time the sound of iron echoed like a muffled wail, logic seemed to slip a little further from my grasp. And it was at that moment that I realized that fear was beginning to overcome reason. Because if those crosses weren't moved by the wind, what then could be giving them orders? When we realized what was happening, our immediate reaction was to try to find rational explanations. It was easier to believe there was something wrong with the ground than to accept the absurd idea of heavy crosses moving on their own. One of my companions suggested that perhaps the ice had formed irregularly, creating an invisible pressure pushing against the iron bases. Another commented that it could be some underground air current escaping through unseen cracks. I forced myself to grasp any possibility, even if it sounded unlikely. But the more we tried to find a logical explanation, the more the phenomenon seemed to mock us. The movement wasn't chaotic, as it would be if caused by natural forces. There were no different inclinations, no crosses toppling in random directions. They all followed the same slow, ponderous rhythm, turning in perfect synchrony until they stopped. Motionless in an identical position, it was impossible to call it a coincidence. I remember kneeling before one of the graves, placing my hand at the base of the cross to feel for any shifting in the ground. It was firm, frozen to the ground, and yet it moved as if an invisible force was coursing through its buried roots. When I released the icy iron, I realized my fingers were trembling not only from the cold, but from the growing fear that I was not facing a natural phenomenon, but something completely beyond human comprehension. My companions also began to fall silent. Nervous comments were replaced by fixed stares, and no one dared laugh at improbable theories anymore. The group's silence was broken only by the metallic sound of the crosses rotating in unison, as if an invisible march were taking place before us. With each passing moment, it became more evident that there was no wind, no flaw in the ground, no trickery by some hidden vandal. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. The movement didn't stop randomly, it was deliberate. All the crosses were turning in the same direction, as if receiving a collective command. And when they finally stopped, I realized they were pointing precisely at a specific spot outside the cemetery boundaries. The more I observed that collective movement, the more I felt the strange sensation of being in the presence of a hidden troop, an army that never stopped marching. The creaking of iron against ice no longer sounded like simple friction, but like measured footsteps, echoing in the silence of the early morning. Each cross rotated in unison, as if obeying an inaudible command that only they could hear. It was impossible not to imagine the image of soldiers lined up, responding to an order from an invisible commander. The cold seemed to intensify as this happened, as if the very air had been filled with a collective presence. My companions felt it too. I could see in their eyes the same chill that ran across my skin. No one needed to say anything. Everyone understood that we were not simply witnessing moving crosses, but something carrying a disturbing discipline, a cadence of war that should never echo in a place of rest. I tried to look away, as if by refusing to witness, I could deny reality. But it was impossible. The synchronicity was hypnotic, almost ritualistic. The crosses turned together, stopped together, as if awaiting a new order to continue. With each pause, the silence seemed to scream louder than any noise, a void filled with expectation, like the interval between one command and the next on a battlefield. At one point, I thought I heard more than just the creaking of iron. A muffled sound, like distant voices, mixed with the non-existent wind. It was as if whispers echoed from beneath the earth, overlapping voices in a language I couldn't discern. I clenched my fists, trying to contain my fear, but I knew that night had already surpassed the limits of what could be. Explained, and then, in a final collective movement, the crosses settled into place, all facing the same direction. There was no doubt. It wasn't chance. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a choice, as if something there had decided to point the way for us. The next morning, after a night in which neither of us could sleep soundly, we returned to the cemetery to try to make sense of what we had witnessed. The sun barely pierced the dense clouds, and the accumulated snow reflected a dull light that made the place even more eerie, as if the night hadn't completely ended. I walked slowly among the graves, trying not to stare at the crosses, but it was impossible to ignore their alignment, all facing the same direction. The sight made me nauseous, as if the place had been marked by an invisible order that still echoed. It was then that we began to examine the inscriptions engraved on the tombstones more closely. Name after name, date after date, a disturbing truth unfolded before us. These were no ordinary people buried in that area. All, without exception, were soldiers, war veterans, men who had fought in battles that marked history and who, even in death, seemed to still respond to commands that no longer belonged to this world. The discovery immediately silenced us. I carefully read the corroded inscriptions, saw military symbols, medals engraved in the marble, and dates dating back to conflicts that had already become history books. It was as if this part of the cemetery were a buried battlefield, an army sleeping side by side, unable to find true rest. The idea began to form in my mind inescapably. The crosses weren't just moving without reason. They were obeying an order that might never cease, even after death. The most disturbing thing was realizing that all the crosses, without exception, pointed to the same spot outside the cemetery. There was no deviation, no confusion. It was a direct line, a precise indication. The soldiers buried. There seemed to be turning towards something that still called to them, as if awaiting the sound of a bugle that echoed from the other side of the darkness. And when we finally realized where they were pointing, a heavy silence fell between us. The direction was clear. All the crosses faced the city's abandoned barracks, a ruined building that carried within it memories of war and tragedies never fully told. I'd passed that abandoned barracks countless times, but never had I felt the need to stop and observe it so closely. It was an old building, constructed of dark brick, with broken windows that resembled empty eyes staring out at the street. The walls were covered in moss and cracks, and the old American flag, faded and torn, still hung from a leaning pole, as if withstanding the test of time, but lacking the glory it once held. There were stories that the place had been hastily closed after a tragedy involving soldiers in training, but no one spoke of it out loud. That morning, as we watched the direction of the crosses in the cemetery, I knew I had to go there. Each step toward the barracks felt heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to impede my approach. When I reached the rusted gates, I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold. The air around me was denser, heavier, as if the place held memories that refused to die. I looked inside, and the silence was absolute. The dark corridors seemed to stretch on forever, and each empty room carried the feeling that someone was still there, awaiting orders. It was easy to imagine the soldiers' voices echoing, the sound of boots hitting the hard floor, the dull thud of weapons being readied. The absence of life didn't erase the invisible presence that dominated the room. It was then that I understood what was truly tormenting me. The crosses weren't just pointing to that barracks. They were responding to it. It was as if, even buried, the soldiers were still being summoned to form ranks before a command that hadn't dissolved with death. And the next night, we would see with our own eyes the weight of that calling. The following night, I returned to the cemetery, accompanied by the same men who had witnessed the impossible with me. The cold was even more severe, but that wasn't what made us shiver. There was something different that early morning, a tension in the air that couldn't be explained solely by the temperature. The sky was clear, and the moon illuminated the graves with a pale, almost theatrical glow, as if the world had prepared to witness what was about to happen. We approached the soldier section in silence, each step marked by the snow crunching beneath our boots. And when we arrived, we didn't even have time to exchange glances. Ahead of us, the crosses began to move again, one after the other, as if obeying a bugle call only they could hear. The metallic sound echoed through the frozen air, and soon there were no longer just a few, but all of them, spinning in perfect synchrony. The iron scraped against the ice, creating a measured rhythm, reminiscent of a military march. The sensation was unbearable. We weren't facing crosses moving randomly, but an invisible army, a troop of men who had never abandoned their ranks. The crosses stopped simultaneously, pointing back toward the abandoned barracks. The silence that followed was so profound that I almost believed I would hear voices or footsteps coming from the distant building. My companions were motionless, and I knew we all shared the same thought. The soldiers did not rest. They still responded to orders, even from the other side of death. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move between the tombstones, tall and rigid, like the silhouette of a man in uniform. I blinked, and it vanished, but fear had already crept into me in a way I would never forget. We knew this wasn't the end. This was just a warning. Since that night, I've never been able to walk past the barracks without feeling invisible eyes watching me. And whenever I remember the crosses spinning together, I feel like other stories are still buried, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Because deep down, we all knew that wouldn't be the last time we'd witness the impossible inside a cemetery. There are stories that resist time, secrets that remain buried beneath the cold earth, but insist on revealing themselves when we least expect it. I've always believed that crosses were symbols of rest, silent marks of faith that served only to remind the living that death is inevitable. But I learned the hard way that even these symbols can rebel against oblivion. One night, I witnessed something impossible, something that shouldn't have happened. The cross of a priest accused of heresy not only refused to remain still, but seemed to carry within itself a fury that permeated the freezing dawns. It wasn't a simple movement caused by wind or weather. The cross rotated violently, as if trying to free itself from the earth that held it. The sound was like iron scraping against the ground, a noise that echoed through the empty cemetery and made every shadow seem denser, more alive. I'd seen strange things throughout my life as a gravedigger, but nothing approaching this. Every dawn, the phenomenon repeated itself, always on the same grave, always with the same intensity, as if something there refused to accept the silence of death. It didn't take long for me to realize this was no ordinary occurrence. This was no ordinary tomb. It belonged to a priest rejected by his own community, someone who had been accused of heresy and buried on the sidelines, as a warning that his memory should be forgotten. But from what I witnessed, his story was far from buried. The cross wasn't moving by chance. It was as if it wanted to tell something, as if it were trying to reveal a truth that should never be known. And to understand why that tomb would become the most feared in the entire cemetery, we must go back to the priest's dark past, when his life still walked between faith and condemnation. If this story has already given you chills, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. That way, you won't miss any of the next dark stories I have to tell. From an early age, I had heard stories about that priest. The village elders spoke his name cautiously, as if merely mentioning it would bring misfortune. He was described as a man who began his journey full of devotion, respected by all, but who, as the years passed, immersed himself in ideas that the church itself condemned. Some said he preached distorted messages, mixing faith and rebellion, attracting followers who venerated him more as a prophet than as a priest. For many, this was enough to transform him into a heretic, someone who challenged the very institution that had once granted him authority. The community's judgment was relentless. He was shunned, abandoned by those who had once exalted him. His death was greeted not with mourning, but with a resentful silence. They refused to allow him to be buried in the center of the cemetery, alongside the other priests. Instead, his body was placed in a secluded section, as if even in eternal rest he would bear the mark of rejection. The iron cross they placed over his grave was not a symbol of honor, but of shame, a bitter reminder that this man had been condemned not only by the church, but by the collective memory of the village. And it was precisely this cross that years later I saw move with impossible force. Perhaps it made sense after all, that someone whose life had been beset by accusations and curses had found no rest in death. But at that moment, given what my eyes witnessed, the feeling was that we were not simply dealing with the restless spirit of a priest. There was something deeper and darker manifesting in that tomb. And it was on the first morning, when the cross decided to show its fury, that I realized that story was still far from over. The first time I witnessed the phenomenon occurred one early morning, when the cold seemed relentless. I was walking through the cemetery as usual, checking to see if the extinguished candles had left any traces of fire and that no graves had been disturbed. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the distant creaking of the dry trees surrounding the walls. It was then that a sharp, repetitive, metallic sound broke the monotony of the night. I approached slowly, guided by the flashlight, until the light illuminated the priest's grave. The scene stopped me in my tracks. The iron cross moved violently, as if being shaken by invisible hands, pushing it back and forth. The iron scraped against the ice-hardened base, producing a noise that reverberated throughout the area, echoing like a distorted sermon. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't a gentle movement. It wasn't the sway of a breeze. It was force. It was fury. I stood frozen, unable to look away, as the object spun abruptly, tilting almost impossible for something embedded so deeply in the ground. I tried to rationalize. It could be the ice expanding or some instability in the terrain. But no explanation seemed to hold up against what I was witnessing. It was as if the cross were alive, trying to free itself from the weight of the earth that imprisoned it. At that moment, the air grew denser, heavier, and I had the strange sensation that I was not alone. It was as if the priest, the same one who had been rejected by the community, was still there, protesting against oblivion, refusing to be silenced. And it was that very night that I decided I had to do something. I couldn't let this phenomenon continue. I believed that if I fixed the cross with cement, perhaps I could silence that unrest. But I had no idea what I was about to unleash. After that night, I couldn't find rest. I closed my eyes and still heard the sound of iron scraping against ice, a metallic wail that seemed to repeat itself inside my head. I needed to do something, needed to believe there was a way to control this before it got bigger, before others noticed and spread rumors throughout the village. So, the next night, I returned to the cemetery not just as an observer, but as someone willing to face the inexplicable. I took with me tools, buckets of wet cement, and the conviction that I could end this disturbance with my own hands. I arrived early. The sky was still pale, and began the work of preparing the cross's base. I poured cement liberally, filling every crack, every space where ice could seep in. Sweat dripped down my face despite the biting cold, and my hands trembled, not only from the temperature, but from the strain of what I was doing. I believed that by sealing that cross to the ground, I would finally silence the fury that raged night after night. I worked for hours until the cross was firmly attached. I tested its resistance, pushing with all my strength. It didn't budge. For the first time in days, I felt a brief relief, as if I'd regained control. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, convinced the torment was over. But it was when night fell and absolute silence fell over the cemetery that I realized how wrong I was. A sharp crack echoed through the air, and then another, like bones breaking. The cross began to tremble before me, even though it was fixed to the cement. Seconds later, I heard a sharp sound, and the iron cracked in half, shattering like fragile wood. The entire structure fell on its own, without my being able to do anything. The instant it toppled over, something even more disturbing happened. At the now exposed base, covered in damp earth and broken cement, was a hidden inscription, carved in words that shouldn't have been. There, when the cross fell, I stood for a few moments just staring at the void before me, unable to believe what had just happened. The heavy iron, reinforced with wet cement, had simply shattered as if made of glass, leaving the base exposed. At first, I thought I would see only rust marks or cracks from age, but when I shone my flashlight on the spot, I realized there was something engraved there, something that should never be hidden beneath a cross. On the damp, darkened surface, Latin words appeared in jagged lines, some eroded by time, but still legible enough to send shivers down my spine. I didn't speak Latin fluently, but I knew fragments, expressions I remembered hearing at wakes and masses. And these inscriptions were anything but pious prayers. They were curses, dark invocations, phrases that spoke of fire, eternal damnation, and an inevitable return. With each word I recognized, the weight in my chest grew, as if my very breath were being pulled by something invisible. There were symbols too, rudimentary figures engraved with disturbing precision, interlocking circles, signs resembling eyes, and an inverted cross at the center. The feeling was that this priest, upon being condemned by the community, had left a secret message engraved beneath his own grave, as if he knew someone would one day find it. The cross that rotated every night no longer seemed a blind protest, but a deliberate warning, an attempt to reveal what should have remained buried. I felt my hands tremble, and for a moment I wanted to cover the inscription with earth and forget what I had seen. But something inside me stopped me. It was as if, by revealing those words, I had opened a door that could never be closed. The silence around me became unbearable. I thought I heard whispers, low voices that mingled with the non-existent wind. I turned my head several times, expecting to find someone behind me, but there was no one. Just me, the grave, and those words burning in my mind. It was from that night on that I realized it wasn't just the priest's cross that was restless. Something much larger had awakened, and the entire cemetery would begin to show signs of it. After that night, I realized the evil was no longer confined to the priest's tomb. What had previously been an isolated phenomenon began to spread, as if the hidden inscription had unleashed something that could no longer be contained. The first morning after the discovery, I returned to the cemetery with a heavy heart, fearing I would see the fallen cross again. But what I found was far worse. As I crossed the area, I noticed that other crosses from different tombs were slightly out of place. Some were rotated just a few degrees, others tilted as if they had been pushed. At first I thought I was just imagining it, until I heard the metallic sound again, not coming from a single point, but from several. I walked slowly between the rows, and one by one the objects began to move before my eyes. They weren't just crosses. Bronze plaques clinked on their own, small statues of angels rotated on their bases, and even unlit candles slid a few inches without anyone touching them. That section of the cemetery became known among the gravediggers as the Corridor of Restless Crosses. None of us liked to say that name out loud, but we all knew what it meant. Something had spread, like an invisible wave that reached everything around the priest's grave. Each night, the movements grew more intense, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I began to avoid long shifts in that area, but duty required me to keep watch, and whenever I found myself alone there, I had the impression that the objects not only moved on their own, but were waiting for me to do so. It was as if they wanted to show me that I had triggered something that should never have been revealed. It was at this point that rumors began to spread among the villagers. People claimed to hear voices in Latin as they passed near the walls. Others swore they saw figures walking among the tombstones at nightfall. Collective fear began to set in, and I knew that soon the entire community would turn to me, the only one still approaching the corridor of Restless Crosses. It wasn't long before the rumors spread beyond the cemetery walls. The entire village seemed to breathe fear whenever the topic came up. Some residents avoided even mentioning the priest's name, preferring to refer to him simply as the one who did not rest. Others swore that as they passed through the nearby streets, they had heard murmurs in an ancient language, accompanied by footsteps echoing in the void. With each new report, the feeling that something terrible had been unleashed became harder to ignore. I myself began to feel the weight of isolation. People who had previously greeted me with respect now looked away, as if the mere fact that I was the gravedigger was enough to make me complicit in this phenomenon. Children were forbidden from approaching the cemetery gate, and even funerals began to be rushed so that no one would have to linger too long near the Isle of Restless Crosses. Some more superstitious residents left anonymous notes on my door, asking me to abandon my work and burn the cursed section, as if that were possible. Others simply looked at me with pity, believing I was already scarred by what I'd witnessed. I knew I couldn't share the whole truth, because if I recounted what I'd seen in detail, no one would dare even cross the street that led to the cemetery. Over time, I realized I had become the involuntary guardian of a secret no one else wanted to carry. I was the only one still walking among those graves, the only one remaining to witness the restlessness of the crosses and the impossible movement of the objects. And it was precisely in this solitary burden that I experienced the most terrifying dawn of all, when I realized that the priest's presence not only remained there, but seemed to rise again before me. That last dawn, the cold seemed more cutting than ever, as if the wind itself were charged with a malignant intent. I walked toward the corridor of Restless Crosses with heavy steps, feeling my heart beat irregularly, almost as if trying to warn me not to proceed, but it was too late to retreat. I needed to see how far this disturbance could go. The silence around me was so profound that even the sound of the snow crunching beneath my boots seemed like a thunderclap in the night. When I finally approached the priest's grave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cross that had cracked and fallen, shattered into pieces days before, was standing again. There was no cement supporting it, no tool marks, just the cold, imposing iron, as if it had decided to rise on its own. My eyes struggled to believe it, but reality imposed itself with a brutality that no explanation could soften. The cross vibrated slightly, as if breathing, and then began to spin, slowly at first, until it reached an increasingly intense rhythm. The air grew heavier, and for the first time, I felt I wasn't just witnessing a physical phenomenon. The presence was palpable. I could feel someone there, behind me, whispering in a language I didn't understand, but which seemed to pierce me from within. The ground seemed to tremble slightly, and for a moment, I was certain that the grave held not just bones, but something still crying out for a voice. I stood, paralyzed, watching the cross spin endlessly, until suddenly the movement abruptly ceased. Silence returned, but it didn't bring peace. Instead, it left an unbearable certainty. It wasn't over. The priest was still there, and perhaps he had never left. And that's why I need to tell you. Some stories don't end when we think everything has been told. This was just one of them. If you want to continue following real and disturbing stories like this, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the bell, so you don't miss the next videos, and stay with me, because there are still many more dark secrets hidden underground.